Jannik Sinner just completed the career Golden Masters. 9 tournaments, 9 titles. And the man's first response wasn't to call his fitness coach, wasn't to book a clay court practice block in Paris. It was to go home, to sit with his family, to switch off tennis entirely for 2, maybe 3 days. Now I know how that sounds on paper. But before you mistake this for a feel good human interest story, I want you to understand exactly what that decision tells us about where Sinner's head is right now and why it should make every other Roland Garros contender genuinely nervous. Because here's the thing nobody is saying loudly enough. The players who are already in Paris, already grinding baseline repetitions in the clay, already obsessing over their Roland Garros draw, those are the players who are scared. Jannik Sinner is not scared. And that psychological distance between him and the rest of the field is right now the single most underrated factor heading into the 2026 French Open. I was watching the tape from his semi-final against Daniil Medvedev in Rome, and there's a moment late in the third set. Sinner is visibly fatigued. You can see the slight drop in his shoulder rotation when he's loading up on his forehand. The topspin RPM dips noticeably compared to what he was producing in the first 2 sets. But watch what he does at 5 to 4, 30-40. Medvedev pushes him wide to the backhand corner, the kind of angle that forces a defensive lob from almost anyone at that stage of a three-setter. Sinner doesn't lob. He takes a compact backswing, redirects down the line with disguised clean winner. That is not fitness. That is internal composure operating at a level that most professionals on tour simply cannot access under that kind of physical duress. Now, here's the bit that actually bothers me, and I mean this as a compliment. Sinner told the press conference, verbatim, tennis zero. For 2 or 3 days, zero tennis. And his team is apparently still debating whether there will be any physical work at all during that window. From Thursday, he intends to be in Paris preparing. That gives him, by my count, a preparation window of roughly 10 to 12 days before Roland Garros begins. For almost any other player in the world, I would call that reckless. For Sinner, I think it might be the exact blueprint that wins him a second Roland Garros title. Here's why. Novak Djokovic, the only other man in the history of professional tennis to complete the career Golden Masters before Sinner, was a master of strategic load management. The Serb understood long before sports science made it fashionable that the body has a finite number of elite performances in a season. You do not spend those performances in practice. You bank them, you hoard them, and you deploy them when the Grand Slam draw opens. What Sinner is doing right now is not laziness. It is the behavior of a champion who has internalized that lesson at 23 years old. That is frankly alarming for everyone else. Let me put the Rome campaign in proper context because I think the way this fortnight unfolded tells you everything about his readiness. His first 4 matches against Sebastian Offner, Alexei Popyrin, Andrei Pellegrino, and Andrei Rublev were exercises in controlled dominance. If you watch the Rublev match specifically, Sinner's inside-out forehand was operating at an almost unfair level of efficiency. Rublev is a baseliner who generates enormous pace, and the conventional wisdom is that you trade with him, you absorb, you wait for errors. Sinner didn't trade. He dictated. He was stepping into the court on the Rublev serve return, something very few players attempt against a first serve that heavy, and using the pace against him with redirected cross-court backhands. The breakpoint conversion rate in that match was clinical. When Sinner gets a sniff on a return game, he closes it out. There's no hesitation, no second guessing the shot selection. Then comes the Medvedev semifinal, and this is where the story gets genuinely complicated because Medvedev on clay in 2026 is not the same player who struggled on the surface for years. The Russian has rebuilt his movement patterns. He's generating more net clearance on his ground strokes, and his counterpunching on slow courts has become a legitimate weapon. He took Sinner to 3 sets. He made him uncomfortable. And midway through that match, watching Sinner physically labor between points, there was a window, a genuine window, where I thought Medvedev was going to steal it. He didn't. And the reason he didn't is the same reason Sinner can afford to take 3 days off right now. Because when it mattered most, when his body was compromised, when the crowd noise was building, when Medvedev was leaning into his flat counterpunching game and denying Sinner any rhythm, the Italian's decision making didn't deteriorate. That is the marker of a true champion. Technical execution collapses under fatigue. Mental architecture doesn't. Sinner's mental architecture is bulletproof right now, and that is a product of winning, not of practice. Winning. The final against Casper Ruud was almost anticlimactic in how surgical it was. 6-4, 6-4. Ruud is a brilliant clay court competitor. Top heavy topspin, excellent net approach on clay, tremendous fight. But Sinner neutralized his forehand angle, the shot Ruud uses to create space. by standing 2 feet further inside the baseline than the conventional defensive position. Watch the third game of the first set. Ruud goes for that sweeping forehand to Sinner's backhand corner that usually pushes opponents off the court. Sinner is already there. He takes it early, redirects with interest, and Ruud is suddenly defending. That pattern repeated itself throughout the match. Rude never found an answer. Now, if you're a purist, you're going to hate this next part because I think the narrative around Sinner going into Roland Garros is being catastrophically undersold by mainstream tennis media. People are framing this as can Sinner back it up, as if Rome was a surprise, as if there's some doubt that needs resolving. I want to push back on that framing aggressively because the data doesn't support doubt. It supports inevitability. Sinner is the only active player who has now won all 9 Masters 1000 events. That means he has demonstrated the ability to win on every surface, in every pressure environment, against every playing style the tour can throw at him. At 23, the question going into Paris is not whether he can back it up. The question is how many sets the eventual finalist takes off him. Here's what the coaching community is quietly discussing, and I've been paying attention to the conversations happening around the tour. There is a growing belief among technical staff that Sinner's kick serve has undergone a significant mechanical refinement this clay swing. The ball is kicking higher and wider to the ad court than it was 12 months ago. That matters enormously on clay because the slower surface gives the ball more time to climb after the bounce, and Sinner is exploiting that physics ruthlessly. On a kick serve that bounces to shoulder height on a right-hander's backhand, there is no clean, aggressive reply. You are immediately playing defense. That is a massive weapon going into the longer format Grand Slam environment. I was looking at the tape from the Pellegrino match, a match that got very little attention because Pellegrino is unseeded, and you can see the evolution of that serve clearly. At 40-15 in the fifth game, Sinner goes out wide to the deuce court with a kick serve that generates a kick angle of roughly 30 degrees. Pellegrino can barely get a racket on it. That's not a power serve, that's a geometry serve. And on Roland Garros clay, where the court plays slow but the bounce plays high, that weapon is going to cause significant disruption. Now, here's the bit that actually bothers me about the rest of the field, and this is where I want to be direct. Carlos Alcaraz is the obvious counterweight to everything I have just described. The Spaniard is the defending champion. He has proven he can win Roland Garros. He's done it. He generates the kind of topspin RPM that makes the clay surface feel almost unfair for opponents, and his court coverage is, on the right day, arguably better than Sinner's. But Alcaraz carries a psychological complexity that Sinner simply does not. When Alcaraz hits a wall mid-match, you can see the internal argument playing out on his face. When Sinner hits a wall mid-match, his face tells you nothing. That gap, that emotional opacity, is what Rome just confirmed at the highest level. And what about Alexander Zverev? The German has been knocking on the door of major success for years. He has the firepower, he has the serve, one of the best in the business, and his forehand can be genuinely devastating when he's locked in. But Zverev's breakpoint conversion on clay has been inconsistent enough to suggest that when the match enters a decisive phase against a player of Sinner's caliber, there are question marks. I'm not dismissing him. I'm saying that the margin for error against the current world number one is so thin that inconsistency becomes a fatal flaw. My prediction for the next 3 months is this: Jannik Sinner wins Roland Garros. Not because of what happens in the next 10 days of preparation, but because of what happened in Rome, because of what's happening right now in a family home somewhere in northern Italy, where the world number one has completely switched off the noise and is resting in the confidence of someone who knows exactly who he is. He'll arrive in Paris refreshed, technically sharp, and mentally untouchable. The rest of the field will have spent those same days overthinking, overhitting, and quietly terrifying themselves with the footage of a man who just completed tennis history. And when the draw is made and the first balls are struck on Philippe Chatrier, the tone of this entire Roland Garros will be set by one simple fact: Jannik Sinner doesn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He's already done it, and that is the most dangerous man in professional tennis.